using the theory of challenge and threat states in athletes. So why we have chosen this is because it's a widely used theory that helps address stress in athletes, and we thought it would be really applicable to share this with the parents so that we would have a proactive approach versus a reactive approach. So what's in store? First, we're going to discuss what is stress. Secondly, we're going to introduce you to the theory of challenge and threat states in athletes. Thirdly, understanding our resources, so that will be our stress defenses. We're going to talk about coping with stress. And lastly, developing outcomes. So today, we're going to have three presenters, myself, Amanda Johnson, Alexandria Olson, and Jelani Robertson. So you will see my face again throughout the presentation, but for right now, I'm going to hand you over to Alex so that she can introduce you on understanding what stress is.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Amanda, for the introduction. So I have the pleasure of introducing you to the concept of stress, and we're going to try to understand stress as best we can. So, understanding stress. Firstly, let's understand that stress begins in the brain, and we have a nice little sort of flow chart here that explains the stress response from a physiological perspective. So what happens is we initially receive information from the outside world, some kind of interaction with our external world, be it an environmental interaction, an interaction with someone, an individual, a conversation. It might be something that is asked of us. We receive some kind of information that we are then asked to process. It then triggers what's known as the amygdala, which is our emotional center in the brain. And it forces us to start to, get the cogs working. What's going on? What is being asked of us? Do I have what it takes to meet this demand? And we're going to keep hold of that word demand. And then it, sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which is our communication center of the brain. The hypothalamus then is able to communicate with our physical body through our nervous system. So it processes it processes what is going on in the brain and then sends a signal to the physical body. Then we receive that physiological response through our autonomic and central nervous systems. And those physiological responses are oftentimes symptoms or signs that we tend to show of stress. And we're going to kind of delve into those a little bit more. So then that communication triggers the release of two hormones known as cortisol and adrenaline. Some of you may know cortisol as the stress hormone, and of course adrenaline is that hormone that we associate with super strength and fight or flight and getting ready and prepared for survival. So of course, in triggering these two hormones, there are other domino physiological effects. We increase our heart rate. We have increased alertness, our breath quickens, and ultimately it prepares our body for fight or flight. Now, do we know what fight or flight is? We may have heard of the terminology before, but effectively it was a survival mechanism that was, that is ingrained in the natural human reaction. So when we are threatened or when we perceive danger, our body then appears to prepare itself to either fight off whatever we are being attacked by or flee or run physically away from the danger. So this, stress response is pretty much designed for our survival and designed for, the time or period in our history where we were hunting and gathering of food, protecting ourselves from predators larger than ourselves and ultimately trying to survive in the wilderness. So therefore, stress was not originally designed to be endured long-term or chronically as we experience stress now in modern life. The stressors of modern life, such as, sitting in traffic, enduring a global pandemic, having to wear a mask all the time, not being able to play sport, those were not the stressors that our stress response was initially designed for. And so although the stresses of modern life have evolved, the stress response within our body hasn't necessarily changed that much. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. It's important to note that there are actually two types of stresses, what we call eustress and distress. And I'm actually going to just go a little bit into each so that we can have a greater understanding. So eustress. Mills, Reiss and Dombeck, who are some wonderful theorists who spoke of eustress and distress, identified the differences between the two. And we define eustress as positive stress, if you could believe there's such a thing. Eustress is short term. It's energizing, it's motivating. It's something that when we receive the demand, we then translate it and perceive it to be within our resources or something that we can do. And hold on to that word resources because we're coming back to it. But something we're capable of, something we are able to complete. It's exciting, it increases our focus and ultimately our performance. We are challenged by eustress and it helps us to push ourselves and grow, and we feel really motivated by eustress. While distress or negative stress, that's often the stress most of us refer to, can last both in the short and long term, although it wasn't designed for such. It generates unpleasant feelings, and we will discuss some of the unpleasant feelings that comes along with distress. It's perceived as something outside of our resources or our coping ability, something that is demanded of us, a demand is placed in front of us, and we believe we don't necessarily have what it takes to complete the task. Either right away we have to get some more resources or we have to do something. So we are a little threatened by distress, ultimately decreasing focus and our performance. So keep those in mind, eustress and distress. Now, of course, the year 2020 came with it a new stress, what's called crisis fatigue. None of us saw a global pandemic on the cards for 2020. I'm sure that was in none of our New Year's resolutions, but here we are experiencing this, and as such, it's coming with something called crisis fatigue. It's a new concept to the world of psychology because, of course, we haven't had a global pandemic in maybe a century. So it's important for psychology to continue to evolve as the times evolve. And so we are trying to get a grasp of what exactly crisis fatigue is. But ultimately, it's the human response to unrelenting stress that can cause a person to feel physically numb or tired. And crisis fatigue comes in 4 main stages. Firstly, looking at the heroic stage, this is, we would have started this stage here in Trinidad around March. Individuals band together the onset of a crisis to determine how do we survive? What are the steps we need to take as a community, as a society, as a global community to save and protect mankind and womankind? Then we get into the honeymoon stage, the reaction to the sense of community that we've developed with others who are also taking the same steps necessary. So we've gone from deciding what's necessary to now working as a global community. Okay, we're all in this together. It's, we're going to, survive effectively. And then we hit disillusionment stage. We feel physically and emotionally exhausted. Hypervigilance now turns into irritation, rage, or despair. What was once something that we were, joining together in a positive effort to survive, we're now disillusioned by it, or it's irritating, it's annoying. I don't want to wear the mask anymore. I don't want to wash my hands all the time. And so we become disillusioned with everything. And ultimately, we then lend to the fatigue stage. And of course, as I mentioned before, by design, the human body cannot sustain high cortisol and adrenal levels for long periods of time. So, of course, this enduring stress, we're talking about almost a year's worth of enduring stress, can result in burnout and can cause a person to be easily triggered or completely withdrawn. It is also the stage when people are more likely to engage in risky behaviors that are detrimental to themselves or others. Oh, it's okay, I don't need to, sanitize these groceries, it's fine. Oh, I don't need to wash my hands, I just sanitize and I'm just popping in and out very quickly. Oh, I forgot my mask, but I'm just going by my family's home, it's fine. We start to take small, very gradual steps, so risky behaviors, take chances with risky behaviors during this stage that can ultimately put us at risk again. So it ultimately comes into 4 steps, and I imagine many of us are experiencing some stage of crisis fatigue, but it's important to keep in mind that this is also a new stress that we are faced with. So we have eustress and distress and then crisis fatigue. So I'd just like you to take a moment. I'm just going to provide you maybe with 2 or 3 minutes to have a bit of a reflection. What do you think, as parents, are some of the eustress and distress demands that your child has been experiencing during this time? What are some of the demands that are being placed on your child athlete? We have a lot of new experiences going on with our youth, and it's important that we recognize what might be eustresses for them and distresses for them. So just take a few minutes and I will come back. Hi again, everyone. So hopefully you had some time to reflect on the potential eustresses and distresses that, or demands that your children may be experiencing during this time. So we had some wonderful contributions in the chat. So one of the distresses is a lot of screen time and no change of environment. Everything is in one place. I think everyone is experiencing this, parents and young athletes alike, because we are all now transitioning into this online and virtual world. So absolutely that can be a distressor, and certainly we would have to, change perhaps the way we perceive screen time and, working virtually, and we'll discuss that as we go along further into our presentation. Another distressor that somebody experiences is limited space to practice sports. So athletes feel like they are losing out on their progress from the year before. And that is, of course, absolutely valid in that experience, because we had to close our facilities. We weren't able to train in team sports, or even as individuals at one point, we weren't really allowed to be out and about. So it was very difficult for athletes, and especially young athletes who are in their prime stages of development, to accept that they aren't able to go to the gym, aren't able to lift weights, even just going out for runs and so on. It was very, very challenging to overcome, and confining ourselves to our home workouts, or backyard workouts, bedroom workouts, wherever it might be. It can be very difficult to try and be creative and find new ways to utilize what was available to us at home. And then thankfully we actually had a eustressor as well, which was getting more organized during the day to fit everything at home and not get carried away from the couch and television. So it would be quite easy, because you're in your home environment, to just sort of relax and take time away from the laptop and so on. But we still needed to be productive. We still needed to progress in work or in sports, and so it was important to have that organization, that schedule, even though we were in the home environment. And I'm glad to hear that was a eustressor, because for many it can be a challenge, it can be or it can be a threatening sort of state to find yourselves in. So I'd just like, in my final slide before I hand you over to the wonderful Jelani, I would like to describe to you the theory of challenge and threat states in athletes. And why am I describing this to you? Well, this is the model that we are using to underpin our entire workshop today. So I brought you the events and demands section, which is the interactions with ourselves and the external world and others around us. How that places a demand, either eustress or distress demand, on us. And Jelani is now going to explain the resources that we might need or use and how we use them. And he's going to go in depth into that. And then Amanda will take us over to the appraisal and performance outcomes. So do stay tuned, and thank you very much for your time. I'll hand you over to Jelani now.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you once again for joining us. I have the unenviable task of following Alexandra Olton after that insightful and in-depth presentation, so I'm going to try my best to make her proud. So what is this resource thing about? So how do we define resources? So when we think about stress or believe we're stressed, typically we're focused on what Alex just covered, the demands of a situation, the stresses, which are the stresses with which we're faced. But stress does not always win, does it? And if not, what happens? How do we cope with stress? So within each of us is our own personal arsenal that enables us to cope with what life dishes out. And this collection is known as our resources. And research has identified 3 primary resources: self-efficacy, perceived control, and achievement goals. And we're going to go into each of them a little bit more right now. So what is self-efficacy about? So these are the beliefs about our competence or chances of successfully accomplishing a task and notably producing a favorable outcome. So according to Bandura, there are 4 sources of self-efficacy beliefs: performance outcomes, which are also known as mastery experiences, vicarious experiences, verbal persuasion, and physiological feedback. And next slide, we just go through some examples and a little bit more understanding of each of these 4 sources of self-efficacy beliefs. So performance outcomes or mastery experiences are typically referred to as the most important source of self-efficacy beliefs. And these are the positive and negative experiences that can influence the ability of an individual to perform a given task. So if one has performed the task reasonably well in the first instance, in the second instance, he or she will be more likely to feel more competent and perform well at a similar task. Vicarious experiences are about when people can develop a high or low self-efficacy just from witnessing other people. So if an individual sees a similar other performing well in a given task, then they might compare that with their own competence and feel confident that, hey, I can do that too. Physiological feedback, quite simply, people experience sensations from their body, and how they perceive this emotional arousal influences their beliefs of efficacy. And this is as simple as waking up one morning and just feeling confident. You know, you wake up and you're like, yeah, today is going to be a good day. Similarly, on the other hand, or rather, one day you might wake up and be like, today is not that day. And we might come across a lot of those days, or might have come across a lot of those days, especially during this new time of crisis fatigue, dealing with the pandemic. And so it's important to keep that communication open between mind and body, so you have an idea of what's going on. It's definitely impacting your self-efficacy beliefs. And finally, and rather important for parents, is verbal persuasion. And self-efficacy is influenced by encouragement and discouragement pertaining to an individual's performance or ability to perform. And so simple things just as words of support, words of motivation can go a long way to affecting someone's self-efficacy. Research has even identified that by simply telling someone they are good at something, they already feel more in a challenge state rather than a threat state. And the reason to why this is important will be explained a little bit later on, but it's good to know that our words can have a direct impact on how an individual perceives stress. So the second resource is known as perceived control. And this refers to the ideas which we hold about our abilities to influence the outcome of various situations in life. Perceived control varies from situation to situation and typically exists on the continuum you see before you. So on one end, it's extremely high perceived control, that's the green end, and on the other end, it's low perceived control. And now why we believe that it exists on a continuum is because one, no one always feels as if they're in complete control of a situation. And reality is, no one is ever in complete control of a situation. Similarly, there's no situation in which one may find him or herself in which they have absolutely no control over anything about it, even if it's as simple as their own response to what's going on the outside world. And so we believe that there's a continuum, and in different situations, individuals find themselves either closer to feeling low perceived control, or the other individuals find themselves more around the higher end of the scale. So what are some examples of low perceived control? Well, an athlete who believes that the wind was the only reason she did not play well during a tennis match, or the student who thinks that he got a C on his math test simply because the teacher marked hard. I believe that as parents and even as supporters, guardians of athletes and children, we have probably heard a few of these things before, right? And this suggests that the athlete or the individual hasn't really taken ownership of the behavior, ownership of their part to play in the outcome that was experienced. On the other hand, some examples of high perceived control. So an athlete who believes that his good performance in a football game was due to his consistency in training attendance, and not only attendance, but effort as well. Or the student who thinks that she got an A on her biology exam because she studied 2 hours per day, 3 times per week for a month prior to the exam. And this directly shows the opposite, right? These individuals take ownership of their behaviors and take an active role in trying to achieve the outcome which they would like to happen. And this, you can already see the links this is drawing to self-efficacy as spoken about previously. So if perceived control is this important, how do we improve these perceptions? I'm glad you'll ask. So increase self-efficacy, especially through verbal persuasion as parents, as this is one of the easiest and most convenient ways of communicating with your child or with your child athlete. You know, we have already discussed how increases in self-efficacy definitely helps the individual to feel more competent and more capable, and also puts them more in a challenge state and a threat state. And so just, you know, words of encouragement go a long way to helping increase perceived control. Focusing on what is in your control as opposed to what isn't is a clear and very explicit way of increasing your perceptions of control. You know, oftentimes we find ourselves focusing on things which we really have no power over. So it might be the wind, it might be the weather, it might be other people's behavior. So, you know, if we can find a way to rather put the focus on what we can affect, definitely improve our perceptions of control. And finally, as parents, giving feedback that is related to effort and progress rather than ability and capacity. And I cannot stress this enough. Effort and progress are small, achievable steps, controllable steps, individual things that could be done and controlled, whereas ability and capacity are rather abstract. You know, so definitely trying to encourage increased effort and noting, acknowledging progress definitely go a long way to improving your child and your child athlete's perception of control. Finally, we have achievement goals. And what are these? So they determine our type of motivation when involved in any given task. So according to this theory, there are 2 types of achievement goals. There's approach goals, which is when we consider what can be gained, and it's about us moving towards success and mastery. Both things sound pretty all right to me. There are also avoidance goals, which is when we consider what can be lost, and it's about trying to avoid failure and incompetence. It's about trying not to look a certain way, right? So it's important to note that there's a bidirectional relationship with resources and achievement goals, in that the more we adopt an approach focus, the more we feel as though our resources have been increased. Simultaneously, the more resources we feel we have, the more approach goals we adopt. And so it's important, again, just to note that they work hand in hand. So what are some examples of achievement goals? So an avoidance goal may be, I'm trying not to come last. And honestly, if you've seen me run a race, this is a lot of times my goal. An approach goal, rather, to that would be, I'm trying to win a medal. An avoidance goal, I just don't want to fail that exam. To my friends who knew me in UE, we're not speaking about this. The approach goal version of that would be, I would like to get an A on that test. And finally, an avoidance goal, I don't want to look stupid. And you hear this a lot when individuals are trying something new, and they just refuse to try because they are fearful of what they might look like attempting something new. On the other hand, you know, the approach goal version would be, I really want to master this new skill. And so with these examples in front, we'd like to challenge you, parents and people who are present today, to just start thinking about how you can reframe any avoidance goal you may hear, and how you can help your child athlete to set approach goals. So what does this all mean? What does this all mean, and why is this important? How does this determine whether we feel challenged or we feel threatened? So when we perceive our demands, so those are the stressors that Alex so greatly covered earlier. When we perceive these demands or stressors as more than our resources, the personal resources with which we have, we perceive a threat state. And you know, the different outcomes associated with this will be explained wonderfully by Amanda in the next section. On the other hand, when we perceive our resources to be greater than or at least equal to the demands of the situation, we perceive a challenge state. And just by the epic graphic shown, you can tell that this is exactly what we're trying to accomplish within our child athletes. And how we go about doing this, again, stay tuned for Amanda, who will cover more. Thank you very much.
Okay, so good morning again, everyone. So my role here is basically to wrap up everything everyone has been discussing. Just waiting for my slide to change. Okay, so where we have reached right now is that Alex and Jelani have done a really great job in covering what events trigger us, what our demands, when Alex spoke about eustress and distress, and Jelani did a really good job in covering the resources part. Now, I don't know if you all have gotten a sense of this, but where we're heading is that we don't necessarily want to have a reaction to stress. We want to have, well, we will have a reaction to stress, but we want to have a more proactive approach where Jelani did a really good job in covering the resources. So what I'm going to take you through now is the appraisal and then the final outcome of it. So again, just to emphasize that this theory that we're using, which is the theory of state stress in athletes, will take us through each of these factors so that we will be able to eventually have a more productive outcome. Because again, stress is something that we cannot necessarily avoid, and we want to have a very proactive approach in it. So let's talk about appraising, okay? So appraising is definitely a cognitive appraisal. It's defined as the different ways in which one interprets information or experiences in the environment. So let's look at that word interpret and experience. This here emphasizes that we all process stress differently. We all process different experiences and situations differently. So again, when it comes to the appraising, which is a very important part, we have to know that there's not a one-size-fits-all for everyone. Some other terms that are used with appraising can include our perception of the stress or our interpretation of the stress. And lastly, after a cognitive appraisal is done, based on your demands and the resources, which is what we've covered before, the general outcome is coping. Now, let's just take a second and think about appraising in stressful situations. Usually when we're in stressful situations, the appraisal is done instantaneously. So if our resources are underdeveloped, then usually the coping process is not beneficial. So again, we want you all to really hone in on that, the resources that Jelani covered, and see what an integral role it plays in the process of appraising. So let's also now look at coping. Coping is a word that's been thrown around a lot, especially due to this pandemic, because it's something that we have really had to, I guess, adapt to. We have to be able to cope because our everyday lives have been disrupted on what we know. And of course, again, we have to learn to adapt to these things. So let's take a look at the definition. So Lazarus and Folkman, who are some theorists who have definitely dived into like stress and coping, they define it as a process of constantly changing cognitive and behavioral efforts to manage specific external and or internal demand or conflicts appraised as taxing or exceeding one's resources. So firstly, in this definition, the word resources rises again because again, it plays a really key element in coping. Secondly, where it says the process of constantly changing tells us that coping is dynamic and we will react differently to demands. And lastly, it looks at cognitive and behavioral factors. So when we say cognitively, it means the ways that we think or we interpret a situation, and behaviorally, the way we will outwardly express what we are feeling and thinking. So again, coping has a multitude of components to it, and we have to understand that resources really and truly play a key part in how we will react to this. So what do we know about coping? Firstly, coping is conscious. It is not automatic. And in saying that it is conscious, it means that this has to be something that is deliberate. So I'm going to go back in again, and you will hear me say resources a lot. But again, we have to be able to develop those resources to have a very deliberate practice in how we cope. Secondly, coping is a response to perception, and we make our own decisions about what is stressful and what is not. So again, leading into that fact that it is a perception. So let's take a look at the coping process. So we have a nice little graph here. It may look a little confusing, but I'm going to take you through it really simply. So any event or stimulus will trigger us, okay? We have different ways in which we react. Before we react, we usually appraise the situation. And again, this is done instantaneously. So we have it when we look at it as either a threat or challenge, which Jelani would have covered before. So then when it comes to coping, we either have no coping and we continue existing, or we tend to adapt a coping strategy. In those coping strategies, we either have an approach or an avoidance. So again, to remind you, the approach is considering what can be gained, and we want to move towards success and we want to move towards mastery. Whereas avoidance, we're considering what we're losing out on and we're trying to avoid failure, which ultimately ends in having incompetence. Okay, so in it, we either cope, we choose to cope, or we choose not to cope, and we have those two reactions. We have approach and avoidance. So let's look at some characteristics, the characteristics of a challenge state and versus a threat state. So that is the outcome of your appraisal. In a challenge state, we have high self-efficacy, high perception of control, and you have focused on your approach goals. Whereas in a threat state, we have low self-efficacy, low perceived control, and we're focused on avoidance goals. And if we look at these words here, again, these are the resources that Jelani would have spoken about, okay? So we talk about some potential outcomes. So in a threat state, what we would really and truly experience at the end would be something similar to this word that we've heard before, I'm sure, called burnout. So burnout is a reaction to a prolonged or chronic stress, and it's characterized by three main dimensions. The first one, we have physical and emotional exhaustion. So some of the things we may experience here, we would have obviously fatigue, we have chronic fatigue, insomnia, we might have impaired judgment or forgetfulness. Sometimes we have loss of appetite, we become more susceptible to illnesses. We will also experience maybe increased anxiety, angry very often, and we might also experience some depressive symptoms, The second one we would have is cynicism and detachment. So in cynicism and detachment, where we would tend to experience a loss of enjoyment or apathy, we just no longer enjoy the things that we used to. We tend to experience a lot of pessimism, so we look at things more on the negative side and not seeing a good outcome to it. And we may experience isolation or detachment. And thirdly, where we would have feelings of ineffectiveness or lack of accomplishment. So here you would have a sense of hopelessness, you would be less productive, you may be more irritable. So if it is that we are looking at the potential outcomes in a threat state and eventually leading to burnout, can you identify some of these things that may be happening within your student athlete right now? So if we could take a second, think about it. Are my children experiencing any of these reactions right now? And if they do, it may be probably because they've developed more of a threat state when they appraise stressful situations. So let's look at potential outcomes in the challenge state. So in the challenge state, we have improved decision making, we have a greater sense of emotional control, we have more task engagement, and we have increased cognitive functioning. So when we look at the potential outcomes in a challenge state, we can see that they are more favorable towards tackling stress. The task engagement and increased cognitive functioning, especially for your child athletes, we look here that they have more fulfillment in what they're doing. So when there's a project, when you have to deal with friendships, homework, training, when they set out to do things, they have more of a sense of fulfillment because there's a clearer pathway in going from point A to B, which is your increased cognitive functioning. So you have a greater sense of whatever is coming at me, I can make a really good decision about it. My emotions are more favorable. I enjoy the task, and then I'm able to have more of a focus on what the task is. So to round this up, obviously, we're looking at having our children be more proactive and developing a challenge response. And in developing a challenge response, of course, this will lead right back into your resources. So what we would want to have is, of course, high self-efficacy, a high perception of control, and you want to be focused on approach goals. So where I want to go into is that let's look at some common practices that can help develop these. So Jelani went through really and truly the core of what they are and what it would look like, but how do we begin developing some of these? So for self-efficacy, we would want our child athletes to have more emotional awareness and more emotional agility. And what I mean by that is your ability to label the emotion, to know what you are feeling. And that goes hand in hand with recognizing your triggers. So what is triggering me and what is the emotion that I'm feeling? We say this and we stress this because a lot of the time we don't actually know what emotion we're feeling. We just know that it feels good or it feels bad. So being able to label that then leads to more agility where I'm able to basically respond and process with more mindfulness and more, I guess, gratitude to help take you through that. A really good way in doing this again, and Jelani would have touched on this, is having positive self-talk. So you want to have positive or helpful self-talk in this to help develop that higher sense of self-efficacy. And another one I put in there is practicing the pause. And this is really important because that pause kind of just, I guess, jams the brakes so that you don't fly into a state where it's not helpful to you. So practicing the pause can be really simple, such as, taking a breath, having a mantra that you say to yourself, having a cue word that you say to yourself to kind of just plug it for a second so that you can think of things and have more and know that you are more in control of the situation. And that leads me right into control. So the second one is a higher perception of control. So here, you want to identify the areas you have control over. And again, there's a phrase that we say all the time in talking about control your controllables. And when we say that, a lot of the times when we speak to athletes, they say, the only thing I have control over is my reactions. But let's try to backtrack on that a little bit. And other things that you can potentially develop control over. For example, how much time I have to complete my homework so that I can get to training on time, so that they have a sense of that. What's a safe space that I can use to be able to do my workout in so that I don't feel too confined? What resources and support do I have? Who is it that I can go to and what can I get from them that I can depend on? So in that in itself, helping our athletes develop that sense of control. And finally, we have the approach goals. And when we look at approach, we tend to have more of a solution focus. So here, I guess it will tie into everything that I'm saying. You seek more information and support. There's more planning happening. There's time management. There's analyzing or reanalyzing because, of course, you may not always get it first the right time, so you reanalyze. You develop self-talk, affirmations. And I know Jelani and Alex will agree with me. The sports scientists in us also talk about wellness routines in the sense that ensuring our child athlete has enough nutrition, rest, they have good sleep hygiene, and then other wellness routines that we discuss are breathing exercises, we have mindfulness, and if you have any more questions about this, we'd be happy to answer them at the end. But again, this is just diving into more practical approaches on what can help develop this challenge response based on developing our resources. So beginning the conversation. So we've covered the practical areas, but how do you as a parent begin to have this conversation with your child athletes? The first one was, what does it look like? And we're hoping that from this presentation or from this workshop, you have a deeper understanding of the stress process, because we believe that when there's understanding, we would definitely have greater outcomes. So what this whole theory has really, I would say, pushed forward onto you is that we really want to develop the resources so that we have more of a proactive approach to stress. And we go to a default setting where our child athlete will be able to tackle whatever it is that may come with you. So in looking like it, as the parent, we would love for you to have a deeper understanding. And again, if you have any questions at the end, we would love for you to ask. What does this sound like? Firstly, as the parent, I would say an emotional component, having room to allow your child to express themselves and acknowledge their feelings. We don't want to trivialize or compare. And when I say that, and this is something, I'm sorry, mom and dad, that I may have heard, is that, oh, you think this is stressful? Let me show you something to feel stressed out about. So it's not really taking into our child athletes actually acknowledging their stress, because again, the times have changed. They're living through a pandemic, going to school online. I can't begin to imagine how difficult this may be. So again, we want to have that emotional component and having room so that you can acknowledge and they can express themselves. And then secondly, we want to draw on the practical component. And in doing that, we want to have, when your child brings the stress to you, having them focus on those resources, having them focus on their efficacy, their self-efficacy, and how they're going to plan forward by emphasizing the ability to use the resources that they have. And lastly, what skills do you need to cultivate? So I kind of go into this. As the parent, you're going to want to have more patience and compassionate and empathetic listening. Listening is tough, right? But we want to have patience, because I know it is difficult. You yourself are experiencing stress, and now your child is experiencing stress, and it's a whole big stress ball and a stress world that we're living in. But again, having that patience and being compassionate and empathetic, okay? And then for the student athletes, again, we want to help them focus on developing those resources. Developing resources are key in helping them cope and manage their stress. We want to help them understand that their demands, we want to help them understand that whatever demands may come to them, they will be able to tackle it. And of course, having those meaningful conversations with them about what are their demands, what is triggering them, and where you can go with that, and how to develop those resources. Again, I know I have said resources a million times, but I think this is one of the key components that we want you to take away, that in developing those resources, it will be more of a proactive approach, whereas a reactive approach where things don't always happen the way we want to. So what are some key takeaways? The first one, stress is a physiological response. It begins in the brain, and then it impacts our entire physical body. Secondly, stress is not always a negative experience. So I know here we have spoken about stress being negative, and we definitely have delved into that side, but helping your child understand that stress isn't always negative, and it can be used as a motivator, as in EUSTRESS, will be definitely beneficial, and pointing that out to them, that say, oh, look, you're under stress, and look at how well you've dealt with this, So having them understand that stress is not always a negative experience. Thirdly, we have control the controllables. So we want to focus on cultivating your child's resources to enable them to successfully face life's inevitable demands. And inevitable is right, because really and truly, we don't have control over what comes to us. And lastly, developing high self-efficacy, perceived control, and utilizing approach goals facilitates an effective stress response by encouraging a challenge appraisal. So I kind of think that does a really good job in tying in everything that we have spoken about today. And I want to thank everyone for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Again, this is a really great toolkit that we have given to you as parents to help take, again, I'm saying these words over and over because I want them to really resonate, a proactive approach by developing the resources that your child may have, And if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask them now in our chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask. And lastly, this is our reference slide. Thank you so much. We want to wish everyone here a very Merry Christmas and all the best for this season, and a very Happy New Year. And we look forward to bringing you new content in the new year. And as always, if you would like to see anything different or new from us, or have any ideas on any presentations or workshops you'd like to attend, also let us know. Okay, thank you again, everyone. As I see, we've had no questions, and we look forward to serving you again.